até que estava Helena, mas fazia tempo que eu não, acho que eu não vinha nesse ano. Ah, claro! Bom, então, novamente, boa tarde, pessoal. Vamos dar início aqui a essa atividade, a essa palestra, com a presença do Hamza Hamouchene, para falar, enfim, para fazer essa palestra sobre ecocídio em Gaza, uma nova etapa do imperialismo ocidental. Vou fazer essa apresentação inicial dele, enfim, em português, porque para a nossa audiência. Depois, a fala dele propriamente vai ser em inglês. Então, em primeiro lugar, comentar, né, que essa atividade é organizada pelo Núcleo Regional do INEU, da PUC São Paulo, que é um núcleo regional composto por 14 pesquisadores, não só da PUC, mas também de pesquisadores que estão associados a grupos de estudos lá, como a professora Isabela Agostinelli, que é professora da PECAP e pesquisadora do INEU e do GECI, né? Então, essa atividade é promovida pelo núcleo regional, pelos grupos, especialmente pelo GECI e pelo NERI, e eu agradeço muito a Ida pela organização do evento e pelo convite. Dando início, então, apresento o nosso convidado, a quem eu agradeço também muito a presença. Thank you very much for being here with us. Hamza Hamouchene é pesquisador e ativista argelino, radicado em Londres, é coordenador do programa para o Norte da África no Transnational Institute e membro fundador das organizações Algeria Solidarity Campaign e Environmental Justice North Africa. Ao longo da sua trajetória, trabalhou em instituições como War on Want, Global Justice Now e Platform London, atuando em temas como extrativismo, recursos naturais, soberania alimentar e da terra, justiça climática e comercial. É autor e editor de 4 livros, Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region, The Arab Uprisings, A Decade of Struggles, o terceiro, The Struggle for Energy, Democracy in the Maghreb, e The Coming Revolution to North Africa, The Struggle for Climate Justice. Hamouchene também contribuiu com capítulos nos livros Voices of Liberation, Franz Fanon, e The Palgrave Encyclopedia of Imperialism and Anti-Imperialism. Seus textos já foram publicados em vários veículos, como The Guardian, Middle East Eye, Counterpunch, New Internationalist, Jadalia, Open Democracy, Roar Magazine, entre vários outros veículos. So it's a pleasure to having you with us. E eu já passo a palavra, portanto, para ele, para sua fala, Ecocídio em Gaza, uma nova etapa do imperialismo ocidental. So, please, Hamza, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Teha, for your kind introductions. Do you hear me very well first? Yeah, perfect. And I would like first to thank Isabella and all the organizers who made this event happen. I'm really delighted to be here with you, to be sharing some thoughts on ecocide, climate crisis, Palestine liberation. This is my first time actually in Brazil. I came on Saturday actually to Rio. I did some events there. And then Sao Paulo. Yesterday I was in Campinas. Back today to Sao Paulo, and I'm leaving tomorrow to Cairo. So I'm really delighted to be here. I'm learning a lot about your country, a fascinating country. It's a big country. So I need to learn more from you and from our interaction and exchanges. So the title of my presentation is based on an essay, a long read, an online long read published on the Transnational Institute website. Actually, it's available in various languages, including in Portuguese. So you can check TNI's website, tni.org, and there is a Palestine liberation series where there are many, many articles. I don't think all of them are translated into Portuguese, but that one is. So let me start. It may feel misplaced or even inappropriate to write or talk about the climate and ecological issues in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. However, what is unfolding in Gaza is not merely genocide. It is also ecocide, or what some have described as a holocide, the deliberate annihilation of an entire social and ecological fabric. Gaza is currently strewn with more than 60 million tons of debris and hazardous material, much of it containing human remains. By early 2024, a significant portion of Gaza's farmland had already been decimated, with orchards, greenhouses, and vital crops wiped out by a relentless bombardment. Olive groves and farms have been reduced to packed earth, and munitions and toxins contaminate oil, soil, and groundwater. Meanwhile, Gaza's seawater is choked with sewage and waste due to Israel's cutting off electricity to power treatment plants, as well as their destruction. Comprehending the ecological destruction taking place within Israel's genocide will illuminate the critical intersections that exist between the climate and environmental justice and the Palestinian liberation struggles. There can be no true global climate justice without Palestinian liberation, just as the fight for Palestinian freedom is inherently tied to the survival of the earth and humanity. I will try in this talk to trace the deep entanglement between Israel's ecological devastation and its settler colonial violence in Palestine, which has reached a peak in the current genocide. This will show how environmental harm has from the start been a core feature of Zionist colonial domination, used as a weapon of control and erasure. From there, my analysis will move through key questions. First, the disproportionate climate vulnerabilities imposed on Palestinians. Second, Israel's deployment of greenwashing and eco-normalization to mask its occupation and apartheid. Third, the current ecocide in Gaza. And finally, I will finish by talking a little bit about Israel's place within the global fossil capitalist and imperialist order. Oh, okay. Let me go back. Perfect. Israel has long framed pre-1948 Palestine as an empty desert, barren desert, an image it contrasts with the blooming oasis supposedly created by the establishment of the State of Israel. This racist environmental narrative depicts Palestine's indigenous people as ecological savages who do not care for and even destroy the land on which they have lived for millennia. This environmental discourse is neither new nor unique to Israeli colonialism. In what she terms environmental Orientalism, geographer Diana K. Davis notes how Anglo-European imaginaries in the 19th century often portrayed the environment of the Arab world as degraded in some way, implying the need for intervention to improve, restore, normalize, and repair it. The Zionist ideology of land redemption is exemplified by the narrative constructed around the afforestation project led by the Jewish National Fund, JNF, an Israeli parastatal organization. This is an Israeli parastatal organization. So through afforestation, the JNF sought to erase the physical and symbolic remnants of 86 Palestinian villages destroyed during the Nakba of 1948. Nakba means catastrophe or disaster in Arabic and refers to the ethnic cleansing and displacement conducted by the Zionists in 1948. Under the guise of conservation, the JNF weaponized the planting of trees to hide the realities of colonial mass displacement, ethnic cleansing, destruction of environments, and dispossession, while creating a new landscape to replace the indigenous one. The Palestinian scholar Ghada Sa'sa brilliantly unpacks such eco-colonial practices, describing them as green colonialism, which means Israel's appropriation of environmentalism to eliminate the indigenous Palestinians and usurp their resources. She describes how Israel uses conservation designation, such as national parks, forests, and nature reserves, to first, justify land grabs, second, prevent the return of Palestinian refugees, third, dehistoricize, Judaize, and Europeanize Palestine, erasing Palestinian identity and suppressing resistance to Israeli oppression, and finally, to greenwash its apartheid image. Israeli resource seizure also extend to Palestine's water. Shortly after the creation of Israel in 1948, the JNF drained Lake Hula and its surrounding wetlands in northern historic Palestine, claiming this was necessary to expand farmland. Yet not only did this project fail to expand productive agricultural land for newly arrived European Jewish settlers, it caused substantial environmental damage, destroying vital plant and animal species, and it severely degraded the quality of water flowing into the Sea of Galilee, disrupting therefore the Jordan River's downstream flow. Around the same period, Mekorot, the Israeli National Water Company, began to divert water from the Jordan River towards Israeli coastal settlers and cities and Jewish settlements in the Negev desert. After the 1967 Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Israel intensified its plundering of water from the Jordan River. Today, the Jordan River, especially its lower stretch, has been reduced to little more than a polluted creek filled with dirt and sewage. Israel's attack on Palestinian environment, whether through afforestation or the draining of water resources, shows how attitudes to the environment sit within the broader settler colonial enterprise. Settler colonialism is a form of domination that violently disrupts people's relationship with their environment by strategically undermining the collective continuance of indigenous communities on the land. Seen in this way, settler colonialism becomes ecological supremacy. It erases the qualities of relationships that matter to indigenous peoples, while imposing colonial ecologies in their place. In this respect, Shurida Molavi argues in her excellent book, Environmental Warfare in Gaza, Colonial Violence and New Landscapes of Resistance, that colonial violence is foremost an ecological violence, an attempt to override one ecosystem with another. A.L. Weizmann from the London-based organization Forensic Architecture concurs, arguing that the environment is one of the means by which colonial racism is enacted, land is grabbed, siege lines fortified, and violence perpetuated. Weizmann observes that in Palestine, the Nakba also has a lesser-known environmental dimension. The complete transformation of the environment, the weather, the soil, the loss of indigenous climate, the vegetation, the skies. The Nakba is a process of colonially imposed climate change. It is in this context of Israeli transformation of the environment of Palestine that Palestinians now face the intensifying global climate crisis. By the end of this century, annual precipitation in Palestine may decline by up to 30% compared to the 1961-1990 period. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, predicts that temperatures will increase by between 2.2 and 5.1 degrees, resulting in potentially catastrophic climate shifts, including intensified desertification. And of course, agriculture, which is a cornerstone of the Palestinian economy, will be severely affected. Shorter growing seasons and rising water needs will increase food prices, threatening food security even further. Palestinian climate vulnerability should be understood within the brutal context of a century of colonialism, occupation, apartheid, dispossession, displacement, systemic oppression, and genocide. Due to this history, there are and will be profound asymmetries in how the climate crisis impacts Israel versus how it impacts Palestinians, as the Palestinian scholar Zina Agha has described beautifully. So, while Israel's ongoing occupation prevents Palestinians from accessing resources and developing adaptive infrastructure and strategies, Israel is one of the least climate vulnerable countries in the region and one of the most prepared to tackle climate change. This is because it grabbed, plundered, and controlled most of Palestinian resources, from land to water to energy, as well as developing on the backs of Palestinian workers and with the active support of imperialist powers, technology that can relieve some of the impacts of climate change, at least in the short term. So briefly, the ability to adapt to climate change in Palestine and Israel is deeply stratified, structured along race, religion, legal status, as well as settler colonial hierarchies. This is often referred to as climate or eco-apartheid. Nowhere is this situation seen more starkly than in the question of access to water. Unlike in neighboring countries, there is no water shortage between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Yet, a chronic water crisis affects Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as a result of occupation, enforced Jewish supremacy, and apartheid water infrastructure. Since occupying the West Bank in 1967, Israel has monopolized water sources, a power formalized in the 1995 Oslo II agreements, which granted Israel control over around 80% of West Bank water. While Israel advanced its water technology and expanded access across the Green Line, Palestinians saw their access decline due to apartheid, land theft, and dispossession. This includes Israel's exercise of control over water resources, strict supply quotas for Palestinians, denial of development such as digging wells, and repeated destruction of Palestinian water infrastructure. As a result, the Israeli Jewish population between the Jordan and the Mediterranean lives with the luxuries of desalination and abundance, while Palestinians face chronic shortages that will worsen under the climate crisis. The disparity is striking. Israel's daily per capita use was 247 liters in 2020, over 3 times the 82.4 liters available to Palestinians in the West Bank. And in the West Bank, Israel's 600,000 illegal settlers use 6 times more water than the Palestinian population of 3 million. Moreover, illegal Israeli settlements consume up to 700 liters per capita daily, including for luxuries like pools and lawns, while some Palestinian communities, disconnected from the water grid, survive on as little as 26 liters per person, lower than in disaster zones, and far below the World Health Organization minimum of around 50 to 100 liters per day. But in Gaza, the situation is worse still. Even before the current genocide, only 30% of households had daily water access, a figure which dropped sharply during Israeli assaults. Israel not only blocks sufficient clean water from entering Gaza, it also prevents the construction or repair of infrastructure by banning essential materials to enter. The result is catastrophic. Prior to the genocide, 90 to 95% of Gaza's water was unsafe for drinking or even irrigation. Contaminated water caused over 26% of reported diseases and was a leading cause of child mortality, responsible for more than 12% of child death in the territory. In this context of restricted water access, climate change's effects on water availability and quality will have deadly results, particularly in Gaza. So in this context, Israel presents itself as a champion of green technologies, desalination, renewable energy projects in occupied Palestine and beyond. It uses its green image to justify its colonial policy and dispossession, greenwashing its settler colonial and apartheid regime, and covering up its war crimes against the Palestinian people by posing as green and an advanced country in an arid and regressive Middle East. This image has been reinforced by the Abraham Accords Israel signed with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan in 2020, and through other agreements to jointly implement environmental projects concerning renewable energy, agribusiness, and water. These are a form of eco-normalization, which means the use of environmentalism to greenwash and normalize Israeli oppression and the environmental injustices it produces in the Arab region and beyond. On 8 November 2022, so around 3 years ago, during the COP27, the climate talks that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, so we have COP30 taking place this year in Belém, Jordan and Israel signed a UAE brokered memorandum of understanding to continue a feasibility study on 2 interlinked projects, Prosperity Blue and Prosperity Green, together forming what is called the Prosperity Project. Under the agreement, Jordan will buy 200 million cubic meters of water annually from an Israeli desalination station on the Mediterranean coast. So this is Prosperity Blue. This station will be powered by a 600 megawatt solar plant in Jordan. This is Prosperity Green. And this solar plant will be constructed by Masdar, an Emirati state-owned renewable energy company. So the benevolent rhetoric behind Prosperity Blue, which is providing water from the desalination plant to Jordan, masks Israel's decades-long looting of Palestinian and Arab water and helps it deny responsibility for regional water scarcity, while portraying itself as an environmental steward and water power. And of course, the other part of the project, which is Prosperity Green, which means that Jordan exports its all the renewable electricity that is generated by the power plant, all of it will be exported to Israel. And when we know that Jordan depends on Israeli gas, which is stolen Palestinian gas, the thing becomes really surreal, the kind of colonial dependencies that are being created. And then we have Mekorot, well, I mentioned that, which is a major player in Israeli desalination, positions itself as well as a global leader, and the profits it generates fund both its own operations and the Israeli government's practice of water apartheid against Palestinians. And then in August 2022, Jordan joined Morocco, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, and Oman in signing another memorandum of understanding, this time with two Israeli energy companies, Inlight Green Energy, ENLT, and NewMed Energy. NewMed is a fossil fuel company that is responsible for the Leviathan field in the East Med. So those agreements were reached to implement renewable energy projects across the region, including solar, wind, and energy storage. These initiatives, both including Project Prosperity and those deals with these two companies, reinforce Israel's image as a hub for renewable energy innovation, while also enabling it to deepen its settler colonial project and extend its geopolitical influence across the region. The aim, of course, is to integrate Israel into the Arab region's energy and economic spheres from a position of dominance, creating new dependencies that strengthen the normalization agenda and present Israel as an indispensable partner. And while ecological and climate crisis worsen, countries like Jordan and others reliant on Israeli energy, water, or technology may begin to view the Palestinian struggle as less important than securing their own access and needs. And in here, we need to point out to the involvement of Gulf companies, such as Saudi Aquapower and the Emirati Masdar in these colonial ventures, which indicates a key structural feature in the Arab region. And I think it's really important to highlight and point that out again and again and again. Rather than viewing the region as an undifferentiated whole, it is crucial to recognize its internal hierarchies and inequalities. The Gulf functions as a semi-periphery or even a sub-imperialist force. Not only it is significantly wealthier than its neighbors, but it also participates in capturing and siphoning surplus value at the regional level, reproducing the neo-colonial core periphery dynamics of extraction, marginalization, and accumulation by dispossession. The horrific crimes Israel is now committing in Gaza against both its people and its environment are an intensification of a long-standing war that has been described by Shurida Molavi in her book, Environmental Warfare in Gaza. Rejecting the notion of the environment as a passive backdrop to conflict, she shows how Israeli settler colonial practices make use of environmental elements as an active tool of military warfare in and around Gaza Strip. In this warfare, the flattening of Gaza's residential areas and the destruction of its agricultural spaces go hand in hand. Israel's ecological violence in Gaza takes the form of razing land, imposing cultivation restrictions on Palestinian farmers, including limits on crop type and even height, and nearly eradicating the territory's traditional olive and citrus groves. Even outside of Israel's periodic incursions and massacres, Israeli bulldozers routinely cross into Gaza to uproot crops and destroy greenhouses. In this way, as documented by forensic architecture, Israel has consistently expanded its military no-go area, or what they call the buffer zone, along Gaza's eastern border. Since 2004, this process has included chemical warfare. Israel regularly deploys aerial crop dusters that spray toxic plant-killing herbicides on Palestinian agricultural lands, hundreds of meters inside Gaza. Even before the start of the current genocide, these practices had decimated entire swaths of arable land, stripping Gazan farmers of their livelihoods and granting the Israeli military improved visibility for remote targeting and lethal strikes. The result is that, in contrast to the miles of irrigated field crops from strawberries, melons, herbs, and cabbages of the Israeli settlements adjacent to Gaza, Palestinian lands in Gaza appear barren, rendered lifeless not by nature, but by design. Rather than making the desert bloom, the colonizers are engaged in a process of desertification, transforming once fertile and active farmland into a parched and scorched area that is cleared of vegetation. It is in this brutal and colonial reconfiguration of Gaza's biopolitical landscape and that of historic Palestine more broadly that Hamas's attack on 7th of October took place. Since then, Israeli crimes in Gaza have entered the realm of ecocide. The full extent of the damage in Gaza has yet to be documented, and statistics are quickly rendered out of date as Israel continues its genocide. Nevertheless, some facts can be presented here. As shown by forensic architecture, since October 2023, Israeli forces have engaged in systematic targeting of orchards and greenhouses in a deliberate act of ecocide that exacerbate the ongoing catastrophic famine, and that is part of a wider pattern of depriving Palestinians of resources for survival. By March 2024, approximately 40% of the land in Gaza previously used for food production had been destroyed, while nearly 1/3 of Gaza's greenhouses had been demolished, ranging from up to 90% in the north of Gaza to about 40% around the southern city of Khan Yunis. Furthermore, analysis of satellite imagery provided to The Guardian in March 2024 shows that nearly half of Gaza's tree cover and farmland had been destroyed by that time, including through the unlawful use of white phosphorus. As The Guardian article describes, olive groves and farms have been reduced to packed earth, munitions and toxins have contaminated soil and groundwater, and the air is polluted by smoke and particulate matter, and it is very likely that the situation has dramatically worsened in the 16 months since these reports were written. One of the deadliest elements in Israel's ecocide in Gaza is its destruction of the territory's water supply. As I said earlier, even before the outbreak of the genocide, around 95% of water resources from Gaza's sole aquifer were contaminated already and unsuitable for drinking and irrigation. This was the result of the inhumane blockade and periodic onslaughts, which hindered the creation and repair of water installation and destruction of Gaza's water facilities and infrastructure, resulting in the collapse of drinking water supplies and sewage management. This is unfortunately leading to high levels of dehydration and diseases such as typhoid. According to the UN Environmental Programme, UNEP, the heavy bombardment of populated areas contaminates soil and groundwater in the long term, both through the munitions themselves and as collapsed buildings release hazardous materials such as asbestos and industrial chemicals and fuel into the surrounding air, soil, and groundwater. As of July 2024, UNEP estimated that the bombing had left 40 million tons of debris and hazardous material, with much of the rubble containing human remains. Clearing Gaza of this war rubble will take 15 years and could cost more than $600 million. Since then, and according to satellite images obtained by the BBC, the amount of debris is estimated to be more than 60 million tons. Israel's ecocide extends to Gaza Sea, which is choked with sewage and waste. When Israel cut off fuel to Gaza after 7th of October, the resulting power cuts meant wastewater could not be pumped to treatment plants, leading to 100,000 cubic meters of sewage a day going into the Mediterranean. Alongside the destruction of health infrastructure, attacks on hospitals and health workers, and the severe restrictions on the entry of medical supplies, this has created a perfect storm for the outbreak of infectious diseases such as cholera and the resurgence of once eradicated and vaccine-preventable diseases such as polio. Taken together, the destruction described here has led many observers and experts to say that Israel's onslaughts on Gaza ecosystem has made the sea, the area, unlivable. At the COP28, 2 years ago, held in Dubai in December 2023, Colombian President Gustavo Petro declared, genocide and barbaric acts unleashed against the Palestinian people is what awaits those who are fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. What we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. As Petro's words make clear, the genocide in Gaza is a warning of what's to come if we don't organize and resist. The empire and its ruling classes are prepared to sacrifice millions, black, brown, indigenous, and white working class people alike, to preserve capital accumulation and domination. Their refusal to commit to climate action at the climate talks that took place in Baku, Azerbaijan last year, while continuing to fund the genocide in Gaza, makes this clear, as did the vaccine apartheid that was evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. Gaza also reveals how war and the military-industrial complex drive the climate crisis. As a matter of fact, the US Army is the world's largest institutional emitter. When it comes to the genocidal war in Gaza, in just 2 months, the first 2 months, October and November 2023, Israel's emissions surpassed the annual carbon output of over 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. Just in 2 months, Israel's CO2 emissions were superior to the annual output of more than 20 nations in the world. And most of these emissions, around 50%, are related to the US military cargo flights and weapons manufacturing. The US then is not just enabling genocide, it is actively contributing to ecocide in Palestine, but the connections runs much deeper than this. The struggle for Palestine liberation is inseparable from the fight against fossil capitalism and US imperialism. Palestine is located in the heart of the Middle East, which remains central to the global capitalist economy, not only through trade and finance, but also as the core of the world's fossil fuel regime, producing around 35% of global oil. Meanwhile, Israel is seeking to become a regional energy hub as well, especially through the East Mediterranean gas fields like Tamar and Leviathan, for which it granted new gas exploration licenses just weeks into the genocidal war in Gaza. US dominance of the Middle East, with the attendant influence on global fossil capitalism, rests on two pillars: Israel and the Gulf monarchies. Israel, described by the former US Secretary of State Alexander Haig as the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk. Israel is the empire's anchor, helping to control fossil fuel resources, pioneering surveillance and weapons, and integrating itself in the region through sectors like agribusiness, energy, and desalination. To advance their dominance, the US and its allies are actively working to normalize Israel's role in the region. This process began with the Camp David Accords in 1978 and the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty in 1994, and was followed by the Abraham Accords in 2020 with the Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Before 7th of October, Saudi-Israel normalization was imminent under US patronage in a deal that would have erased the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian resistance's actions on the 7th of October have disrupted those plans. All of this shows that Palestinian liberation is not simply a moral or human rights issue. It is a direct confrontation with US imperialism and fossil capitalism. For this reason, Palestinian liberation must be at the core of global environmental and climate justice struggles, especially when the COP is next week in Belém. That includes opposing normalization of Israel and supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement, including in relation to green techs and renewables. There can be no climate justice without dismantling the Zionist settler colony of Israel and overthrowing the reactionary Gulf regimes. Palestine stands at the global front against colonialism, imperialism, fossil capitalism, and white supremacy. That's why climate justice movements, anti-racist groups, and anti-imperialist organizers must support the Palestinian struggle and defend Palestinians' right to resist by any means necessary. So I finished my speech. So I have a few copies of the book that covers the whole Arab region. I'm giving them away just by donation to the Ghassan Abu Sitta Children's Fund, which is dedicated to the children of Gaza. So come and take a copy, and I'm happy to sign them. And thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, thank you, Hamza, for this deeply grounded reflection on the intersection of war, genocide, environmental destruction, colonial violence. I point the intellectual courage you have in doing this work and working in the intersection of such difficult issues to put together. But once we listen to you, it's so clear that the environmental destruction is a structural part of this death policy that Israel imposed to the Palestinians. So it's a structural part of the genocide. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I now give the floor to Isabella. She will comment. She will discuss Hamza's presentation, and I can think of a better person to do it, since she did just a wonderful work studying Gaza and this slow death policy of Israel on the Palestinians.
Thank you, Taha. It was actually about that I was going to ask. But first of all, shukran so much for coming here today. I know your schedule is very tight and you have a lot of things to do. So we are very happy to have you here and to listen to you all these amazing points that you mentioned and developed here. Lembrando que tudo que ele escreveu está disponível no TNI, Transnational Institute, tem coisas em português, então recomendo todos a lerem. I actually I have a lot of questions to make to you, but I'll give the floor to all the other people, especially because other students have a lecture after that. So I will just make 2 questions and you can... Yes. The first one is actually about this concept that I tried to develop in my thesis about Gaza. It was before October 7th, and I tried to understand how Israeli policies after the so-called disengagement actually manifested as a slow death policy. So you mentioned the agricultural policy, the water policy in Gaza, and how they now, obviously, they are resource for every basic human life. But even before the genocide, it was really hard to get water, to get food in Gaza and everything. So my question is does this concept make sense yet during the genocide, or we moved forward to a fast death policy? I don't know. Is it possible to have both occurring at the same time during the genocide? The other question is about our dear Global South. So I was thinking about what you mentioned about the Arab Gulf countries being some kind of sub-imperialists. Are they sub-imperialists? Actually, what are the stakes of fostering the normalization with Israel? What does it mean to the Palestinian liberation? And I was thinking maybe normalization actually means impunity to Israel after all, especially in the Global South. So for example, even Brazil goes out and say, our president, for example, says that yes, it is happening a genocide. People during the UN General Assembly left the table or left the room when Netanyahu was speaking, but still they have trade ties with Israel, especially its arms industry that you mentioned. It is the source of our climate change after all. So yeah, that would be my question. What is the role that the Global South can play, or is that even a Global South? Does that even exist? What is China's stance on it, for example? I have other questions, but we can discuss later. And thank you again so much for being here. It's an honor, truly. Thank you.
Maybe we'll take questions then from the audience, since some people are going to leave in 25 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and for this lecture. I was very interested in how this cartography of genocide can be so complex and multifaceted as you showed us. And I was especially curious about the modalities of colonial rule in correlation with the production of mobility practices that you showed us. You mentioned the work of the forensic architecture, which is a very important research group, at least for this discipline of mobility that I'm with my group here. But I would like to hear more about this colonial mass displacement dimension in terms of a cartographic visuality of genocide. I know you were engaged in the Palestine case, but as far as you mentioned other modalities of settler colonialism, I assume that we can expand this imagination of genocide. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you one thing and also make a comment, say something. So you were talking about how Israel make this greenwashing and present itself as someone that can bring technology for renewable energies and solutions for this climate change challenge worldwide. And then you talk about the Gulf countries, and also the Gulf countries have this greenwashing, right, practices. And the point is, they're not seeing. Nobody criticized the Gulf countries as being greenwashing, as making a greenwashing. They say just that they're investing on renewable energy and creating technology, but how this alliance, this proximity between Israel and the Gulf countries made them also a part of this green colonialism, as you say, or this ecological supremacy, and at which extent we could think on them acting together the same way as the US is acting with the Israel to make this genocide in Gaza. And also one thing that is interesting, that although Israel has this image of being this technological and green country, mainly in Europe and United States, here in Brazil it's a bit different, and it's quite interesting that we could think about that, because for us in Brazil it's very clear how the elite, or at least the extreme right, supports practices that are also colonialist and also ecocidal, we can say it, mainly in the Amazon, by deforesting the Amazon and expanding the frontier of the agribusiness and the meat production industry. And also is the same elite that uses the flag of Israel as their symbol of their ideology. So it's interesting how we can also think this Israeli symbolic idea, not only symbolizing the extreme right that we already know, and this white supremacist or the supremacist idea, but also this anti-climate change policies or negationist policies. I don't know, just reflection.
Yeah, please. Yeah, would be good.
Well, I think it also has something to do with what Shahzad just asked, because here in Latin America we have a long tradition of political ecology, of Latin American political ecology, and many authors that discuss how the struggle for territory from the perspective of indigenous peoples, that are peoples suffering different kinds of environmental violence and dispossession, and many elements that are a little bit common to what you discuss. Many authors discuss how this struggle for territory is an ontological struggle for life, for existence, for the right of being, of of remaining. So I was wondering, Isabella asked about the global South. I mean, and now Chaja just said about the elite. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about these struggles from peoples. I mean, from indigenous peoples, from it's a different.
I'll start with the slow death policy, or the slow death framework and concept that developed. And I'd like to hear actually more from you what you think about it. But just quickly, I think the process of slow death and fast death have been happening at the same time. They intensify at certain stages with the bombardments, with the incursions of Israel, and at certain particular moments, at times of the Nakba in 1948, wars, repeated wars, 67, 73, and then the bombing and the massacres that happens. But then the process of slow death, in terms of undermining the livelihoods or the conditions of a dignified livelihood, have been ongoing for decades since the Nakba, in terms of confiscating land, in terms of grabbing water resources, in terms of taking energy. I showed you how the contrast in terms of the inequality in terms of water access. There are a lot of water in Palestine between the Jordan River and this, but the distribution is so unequal. And that creates a lot of problems, not just at the environmental level, but also at the health level, the psychological level. And it affects health of people. It downgrades the environment. It downgrades agricultural land. It affects the food security of Palestinians. Those processes, so people need to know that it's not just about the genocide of the last 2 years. Policy of extermination and elimination that is rooted in settler colonialism has been ongoing for decades in various ways. And Israel found its opportunity after the 7th of October to intensify that process, and they wanted to take it to its end, which means expelling all people of Gaza or exterminating most of them. I think they have not achieved to do that so far, and I hope they won't, through the resistance, through the international solidarity that we are seeing. But I read recently a study, and actually I come from a biology background. I studied health and environment. I studied genetics. And there is a fascinating field called epigenetics. Epigenetics is modification in DNA, not in DNA, like in the core of DNA, but through it, like through methylation, and that they get transferred from a generation to the other, like the trauma. Like a lot of studies are putting forward that traumas get transferred from generation to generation through epigenetic mechanisms. And there was a recent study on the case of Gaza suggesting that trauma is going to appear in different ways in the next generation, and it's going to affect children in different ways. And this is without talking about the malnutrition, the impacts at the psychological, moral, and health level that I'm sure it will affect the way Palestinians are going to look in the next decades. So it's really important to put this on the table. The global South and the Gulf, sub-imperialism, and China. I think these are all big questions. Look, I mentioned in my speech that we need to differentiate when we talk about the Arab region, because there is a tendency to talk about the Arab region, as I said, as a whole, a coherent whole, like as everyone is in the same boat, which is not true. First of all, there are regional differences. There are also national differences, and there are differences between the ruling classes and people. So there are all those hierarchies. But the regional differences are so huge. You cannot compare Saudi Arabia with Yemen, for example, or Emirates with Tunisia, completely into different leagues in terms of wealth, in terms of income, in terms of, political power in the region. But it's not just about wealth inequality. It's about what the Gulf capitalists are doing in the region and beyond. It's not just in the region. They are infiltrating various economic spheres, and their companies are trying to dominate many of those sectors: finance, logistics, transport, construction, and including renewable energies right now. I mentioned two companies, Aqua Power, which is a Saudi company, big renewable energy company, and then you have Masdar, the Emirati one. These are involved in, those colonial projects. Like Aqua Power has projects in the occupied zone of Western Sahara, occupied by Morocco that normalized with Israel. Masdar is doing the same thing. I mentioned Prosperity Project. That Prosperity Project, by the way, has been stopped, like halted, because of the genocide. So they didn't want to appear as, but I'm sure they're gonna go ahead with it at some point. I'm sure there are some negotiations and they are just looking at a different timeline. So the Gulf definitely have been playing a sub-imperialist role in the region, and I would call them traitorous regimes. They serve US imperialist interests, but at the same time, they have their own capitalist interests in terms of dominating the region and getting a slice of the cake. So we definitely cannot see them as, allies, Palestinians, or even allies of Arab populations. They have not been. They've never. Like just in the Arab uprisings, they played a negative role, especially Emirates and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, trying, to put down the revolts, to intervene in various ways at the economic level, supporting regimes here and there. Saudi Arabia intervened in Bahrain in a military way. We've seen tanks going through the bridge to Bahrain to put down the uprising there. So you would see what kind of interests these people, they want to maintain the status quo, their domination in the region under US patronage. But at the same time, they are creating another axis with China. So there is a developing axis, which is, Adam Haniya, for example, developed this very well in the book, actually, when he talks about the oil East-East axis. So the Chinese are involved in the Gulf economies, while Gulf capital is involved in the Chinese economy. And it's not just about exporting raw oil or gas. No, it's much more than that. It's about manufacturing, industrialization, downstream activities. So there is like a very, very complex situation that you can see there. And the Gulf, it's really important to say again, is a key nodal point of global fossil capitalism. That's why the US is really interested and want to dominate the region. That's why Israel is implanted in that area to control the vast resources, not just oil, but also the maritime routes. You have the Suez Canal, you have the Red Sea, you have it is a very geostrategic region. So for the climate justice movement, when we talk about phasing out fossil fuels, at a time when the Saudi energy minister in 2021 said in these words, "We will be the last man standing. Every molecule of hydrocarbons will come out." So when you have such leaders, such policymakers telling you that into your face, it becomes the region, you need to really grapple and deal with these people. So you cannot have climate justice and ignore what the Gulf countries are doing. And I'll touch in here on the greenwashing, and then I'll come back to China and Brazil, because I think it's really important to talk about Brazil. I don't think people are not accusing the Gulf countries of greenwashing. I think the climate justice movement have been doing that for some time. And looking at the challenges presented by the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, in the climate spaces. Like Saudi Arabia, like other countries, the US, and they've been blocking any action, serious climate action in terms of phasing out fossil fuels. But for me, I think the critique needs to go beyond greenwashing. Israel is not just Israel or the Gulf countries are not doing this renewable energy just to greenwash their image. No, they are telling you in your face, we're doing fossil fuels and we're going to continue fossil fuels, including Israel, like trying to give licenses to fossil fuel companies in the first weeks of the genocide. But for them, it's about creating the relevance or maintaining the relevance in that future economy. Maybe that's going to come in 5 decades or something, I don't know. So for them, it's about dominating the new nascent green value chains, controlling them, pushing their companies, pushing their expertise and technology, and benefiting and creating a new capital of, new frontier of capital accumulation. They're gonna make profits. But it's like you see green capital and fossil capital intermeshed with each other. And actually a lot of the time, you find that fossil fuel companies like Total Energy, Eni, BP, disinvested from renewable energies. That's what they told us a few months ago. You find them investing also in renewable energy. It's not just about greenwashing. Yeah, it plays that function. Yes, I agree. It presents them as doing something for the environment and doing their duty. But it's not just that. It's about dominating the new value chains. Brazil. So there is a lot of rhetoric that are, including from South Africa. South Africa has done, I think, a historic thing by taking Israel to the International Court of Justice, and that was a honorable thing, to be honest. I was really inspired and moved by such action, saying like a global South nation that went through apartheid, like taking white colonial regime, taking them to the International Court of Justice. I don't know. Yeah, concretely, that process is moving very, very slow. But still, it has its symbolic importance and strength. But still, Israel, South Africa, still exports coal to Israel. And a lot of the pro-Palestine and climate justice groups were saying, you cannot do that. You know, you need to be consistent. You did this, so move and stop sending coal to these are the normalization and the trade dependencies that are really bad. But during the apartheid in South Africa, that's what people did. They pushed for climate sanctions, climate boycotts. That's how you isolate colonial regimes. That's why it's really important right now to escalate those BDS actions. Brazil, the complicities and the dependencies are much deeper. Brazil sends 9% of its oil to Israel. There are many agricultural and agro-business companies from Israel coming here, participating in your big agro-business sector. I think you buy weaponry and surveillance material from Israel, and I think this needs to stop. You cannot have a president saying this is a genocide and then continuing the economic deals. And this is not like impossible to do. It's about political willingness. You know, it's about bravery. Petro has dared to do it. And I think there is a problem there. I think the company still exports maybe little things, but Petro dared to say, no, we're gonna boycott. We're gonna stop this. So why not Brazil? Why not South Africa? Why not other countries? That I think we need to continue doing that. China, I'm deeply disappointed. I was expecting more. Honestly, I was expecting more. I thought I've never believed like let's say the BRICS space to China is really the alternative, but I believe that the global South and China trying to assert themselves in different ways is a good thing, is a good tendency, creating a multipolarity away from the US-dominated world. That multipolarity creates opportunities and it creates risks. But the opportunities, we can benefit from them as movements, as progressive forces to push for certain things. But China did not want to do a thing. Apart from gathering some of the Palestinian factions in 2024 to bring them together, it still deals with Israel at the economic and trade level. And I haven't seen any significant thing, which is truly disappointing. So I don't know if there is a coherent global South per se. It may take years and decades to come, but it needs to have a clear ideology. What do you want? Are you really fighting for a different world, completely different world from the US dominated thing, or you just want to reproduce that? I think it's still an open question. Shall I continue? Shall I maybe get more questions and then continue? Maybe there are some people who want to give questions before they leave. Maybe give them, yeah, please. And then I'll continue the other ones.
Thank you, Hamza. I would like to ask you about the society transnational level. I think if you can tell us about the some models or some cooperative works that in the international relations can present alternatives for the ecocide. We are here talking a lot about the government level, the elite level. So if you can develop on that, please.
Thank you. Any other questions before I go for the rest? Yeah. Okay. So the question on the cartography of the genocide, the modality of colonial rule, and the production of mobility, colonial mass displacement. You know, when I've been researching this essay, a lot of similarities I've seen, like with the Algerian case. I'm Algerian. I come from Algeria. The colonial experience that Algeria lived in the 19th century until 1962, like 132 years of settler colonialism, one of the most cruel and inhumane colonialism ever. And I've written another article bringing the parallels between Vietnam, Algeria, and Palestine. Actually, it's part of the Palestine Liberation Series. I think it's available in Portuguese. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's in Spanish. The similarities are so baffling in terms of since day one in Algeria as well, at least in the first 4 decades, the purpose or the objective of French colonialism was the elimination of the native. They did everything to eliminate, like horrific acts and barbarism. And what they didn't do in terms of killing directly, disease and famine achieved. Just like in the first 4 decades, the number that people put forward, around 3 to 4 million Algerians died just in 4 decades. A lot of people died in that period. And then came the War of Independence. That's in 1954 till 1962, 7 years. The displacement that took place there and the practices that France, the French colonial rules developed, like mirror a little bit what Israel is doing today. Displacement, internments, the use of famine as a tool to massacre and kill, the way of dehumanizing the other. And I think it's really important to say that the same dehumanization that took place in Vietnam and France, we've seen it in Palestine. That's why the parallels and the similarities in settler colonial states and context is very important. So settler colonialism need to be brought to the table, because I know it's not favored by the mainstream. Greenwashing question, I think is I touched on that. Okay. Indigenous community. I think that's an important point to bring to the table, because Palestinians see themselves also in the fate of the indigenous communities and what happened to the indigenous communities over the centuries. And also indigenous communities see themselves in what the Palestinians are going through today. That's why you see solidarity between even if they are afar, like they're in Latin America or North America, and Gaza and Palestine is far away, and there is of course the language barrier. Let's not forget that. You see statement of solidarity. You see certain delegations going back and forth. I think that needs to be escalated even more, because I hope I am wrong. But I think that's what Israel want to do to the Palestinians. They want to do what the other white people, the white civilizers that came to Latin America did to the indigenous communities. We cannot allow that. And Israelis and Arabs and other people, through their resistance, will defeat that plan. But then, yeah, the indigenous, through their territorial or eco-territorial struggles, they have been facing similar dynamics. And I think they've been calling them colonial dynamics as well, in a clear way. That's why the environmental question, not just like in a liberal or this middle class of way of looking at it, but an environmental narrative that is rooted in land, that is rooted in access to resources, in questions of sovereignty and justice. That's how the political ecology framework works. It's not just environmental like this. For the dominant forces, including settler colonial actors, the environment has been, as you mentioned, a key feature of their domination. Settler colonialism, imperialism is a form of environmental domination. They want to dominate the land. They want to dominate the resource. They want to create a different nature so they can survive and continue, accumulating their wealth and profits. The struggles, the popular struggles. And I agree, I don't think we should just focus on states. It's important to pressure them and continue exercising pressure and using those multilateral spaces, international space, as much as we can, while not being naive that they're gonna deliver liberation, justice, and emancipation. I think they don't do that. Maybe they open up horizons, they create some opportunities, but things need to be built from below at the level of workers, at the level of peasants, at the level of women collective, anti-racist groups, pro-migrant workers, and students, and then the pro-solidarity that we've seen, with pro-Palestine solidarity that we've seen in the last 2 years has been truly inspiring. Like you see that the world is divided. Like you have states, especially the hypocrisy of the West, the liberal West, the loving democracy and human rights West, that they cannot stop teach us about democracy and human rights, and they allow that genocide to take place. Not just allow, they fund it. Like they support it, actively support it. And then the other pole is the people's pole, including in the West. I live in London. Millions of people are in the streets for Palestine. In Italy, a few months ago, a general strike for Palestine. The flotilla was an amazing, inspiring thing. And then there are other campaigns like global energy embargo on weapons, the involvement also of some trade unions. That needs to escalate because it will be painful to Israel and its allies, and they are feeling it. And I feel a reason of bringing that so-called ceasefire and peace deal is the realization by Trump and Netanyahu that the kind of pressure and global pressure is going up, and that can create problems for them. So they wanted to do something to preempt and a little bit de-escalate those efforts. We cannot fall in that trap because what they did in the last 2 years, they need to pay for it. Including, the Western governments, including the normalizers, including in the Arab region, and so forth. This year, 2025, I don't know if you know, is the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. Do you know the Bandung Conference? Great. Bandung Conference was an inspiring moment at the time that united leaders and government representatives from newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. Latin America was not represented in there, but I think it was represented. They did another tricontinental in Cuba. When was that? I forgot. 60 years. Yeah. Great. Okay. I don't think we're in a new Bandung moment yet. Not yet, but as I said, we've seen a reassertion of the global South a little bit. We are seeing a move to multipolarity. The US is realizing that it is declining. It's declining very slowly, but it is declining. That's why we are seeing much more ferocious and cruel response, saying nobody can resist us. So that's why they want to shock the world. But the world has not been shocked. People are in the streets. They are organizing. And I think that's what matters at the end of the day. Yeah. Shall I add more? No.